reason why I love the Orioles as a partner is because they're so likely to make the playoffs. And I feel like those are the teams that would be willing to give up most for a rental. If they have such a high degree of confidence that they'll be playing in October, where relievers can have a more outsized impact on the game, that because of that factor, it makes if you feel like you're renting them for 3 months instead of just 2 months and hoping for the best. And yeah, and especially for an Orioles team that did so well last year, that really there's from where they've been right now, the only place to go is to actually be playing in the World Series. That they'd be willing to like make the leap for something like that. So Connor, I know you had an eye on controllable relievers, but do you think the Orioles would be willing to make the highest bid for Tanner Scott, considering how close they are to building a complete team, and how, given that they're almost locked to at least make it into October already?
Yeah, the point about the rentals does kind of hit the nail on the head for the Orioles. It was one of the reasons why they went for only rentals at last year's deadline. Now, it didn't work out. They traded for Jack Flaherty and Shintaro Fujinami, and neither made any kind of impact in the postseason. And honestly, both guys struggled even down the stretch. I mean, Flaherty didn't even stay in the rotation. So first of all, they know they need to at least upgrade on what they did last year. The funny thing is that it's specifically the Orioles when talking about Tanner Scott. No other team has the same relationship with Tanner Scott that the Orioles do, because Scott came through the Orioles system, came up as this lefty with just absurd stuff. We saw this fastball hitting 100 in the minor leagues. We saw this incredible slider. When he finally came up, the Orioles were in full rebuild mode. So it was just like, give Tanner Scott high leverage innings and see what he can do. And those walk rates were a complete disaster to watch. And he figured it out sometimes, and it was really good when he did. But they made the trade along with Cole Sulser and didn't end up getting a whole lot back in that trade. We'll see what Judd Fabian turns into, which is who they got with the draft pick they acquired. But in general, I think the Orioles would actually stay away from Scott more than other teams would. It would make sense as a rental, but his walk rates are, I believe he's close to 15% on the year. That is back to Orioles territory on his walk rates. And that is when he was so frustrating to watch. Now, his stuff plays better. I know nobody's squaring him up. His hard hit rates are super low. The expected batting average against his stuff is super low. He's a much better pitcher. That's why he's a closer that everybody wants. But I'm kind of scared off by Tanner Scott just because of those insane walk rates and because the Orioles kind of know a little bit of what he is. And that's why I've more identified other guys. But if the O's think that, hey, the stuff is so good that we can live with some of these walks, he does make a lot of sense, because you're still playing for the future, but you are playing for this year. You're going to make the playoffs. You're trying to win a division. You're trying to at least win a playoff game, which the Orioles didn't do last year. And the bullpen needs help. Tanner Scott can help that. He has closing experience. Who knows if Craig Kimbrell will be able to stay in this role for the entirety of the season. And I mean, Tanner Scott right there, the walks going down, the strikeouts going up. I'm sure the Orioles are going to like that as well. I just think there's a lot that can scare Baltimore off, just because of, you can think of it as a positive. Hey, they know Tanner Scott better than any team but the Marlins. You can think of it as negative, as, hey, they know what Tanner Scott can turn into more than anybody else besides the Marlins.
Yeah. I pulled this up just because I know the overall numbers, they do jump out. They scream regression. They scream he can't keep getting away with it. But he, coming out of spring training, was a total mess. It carried over into March, April. And then the switch pretty much flipped a month into the regular season. It went from being not as much of an issue with the walk rates, and now it's pretty closely aligned with where he was last year, when he was just awesome all year long, and where it looked like he took a step forward. So that'll be fascinating to see how other teams handle that. To me, watching him every day, I feel like he has fully turned that corner, and that his overall numbers don't even do full justice to how dominant he is right now. But at the same time, it's a smaller sample, and usually a bigger sample is going to be more telling, especially for a guy that in his career walk rate is insane and scary. So that's going to be fascinating. I'm sure that is why he hasn't been traded at this moment, as there's just so much back and forth in terms of how much value he really has and how trustworthy other teams find him to be, given that history.
And I guess just really quickly want to ask you, Connor, who are the prospects that the Orioles you think would be willing to part away? I know Heston Kjerstad has been a name that's been thrown out there a lot, especially not recently since he got called up, but that's just not a name that seems that would profile what someone like a Peter Bendix is looking for when you're talking about what he is looking for. It's really 19-year-olds, very young prospects that are kind of far away. I know Thomas Sosa, I believe, is who you guys have over there that maybe wouldn't make a lot of sense for a team like Miami.
Yeah, I mean, first thing I'll say to Marlins fans watching, if the Orioles are going after relief pitching, which they will be with Miami, I can't imagine they're trying to target Trevor Rogers at this point. But Holiday, Mayo, Basayo, top three prospects, completely off the table for relievers. I mean, maybe some of those names could come up when you're talking about a top of the line starting pitcher. But yeah, sorry about that one. Jackson Holiday isn't getting moved for a reliever. He's not getting moved at all. He's especially not getting moved for a reliever. What I will say is, the O's have a lot of depth, especially on the hitting side. And I would assume that the Marlins are open to adding hitting prospects because even though there's a lot of injuries, I know they have pitching in their system. And it is interesting to look at, okay, what does Miami want? Because there are some teams the Orioles could be dealing with, like say the Tigers do some sort of sell. They're going to want players that are fairly major league ready. You know, I'm not talking even Tarek Skubal, just maybe some of their relievers or something like that. So they're going to be identifying the Heston Kjerstads of the world, the Kyle Stowers, the Connor Norby guys who are in AAA, have already debuted and could be in a big league lineup right now. But if Miami is willing to look in the Thomas Sosa bin, you know, a guy who was a international signing who has started to click a little bit, a Frederick Bencosme bin who's up in AA as a 20-year-old, as a former international signing who started to hit for the Orioles, you know, in the Dylan Beavers, Judd Fabian bin of outfielders who are starting to put it all together in AA, that the Orioles aren't potentially relying on this year to maybe bring them depth. That is where I think this trade could go through, because the O's are getting really top heavy with their prospects. And I just think because all these guys have now made their debut except for Mayo, they think that, hey, these guys could also help us this year as long as we don't trade them. So they might be more willing to trade someone like a Sosa, like a Bencosme, like a Dylan Beavers, who is a few more years away for the O's. And they know that, hey, we trust our draft model enough that we can replace a Dylan Beavers. You know, we just drafted a Vance Honeycutt. He can replace one of these guys. And I think the O's would be more willing to deal the guys who are still right around their top 10 prospects, but are not, you know, ready to plug in this year.